Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to tell you a bit more about our work. The UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group supports LGBTQI plus people through the asylum system. And we have different services in order to do that. And we also campaign to try to improve the system for people who are seeking asylum, particularly LGBTQI plus people. And I'll tell you about some of those challenges a bit later on, but to start with, I'll just give you a little bit of an outline about the services that we provide. LGBTQI plus people seeking asylum tend to be very marginalised. They face multiple forms of discrimination. For example, they can be discriminated against in the UK because they're LGBTQI plus. They can also be discriminated against because of xenophobia, racism, Islamophobia. But this also happens within the LGBTQI plus community and within the communities from their countries of origin as well. So the difference is that other people who are seeking asylum or other refugees can often have the support of family, friends, or networks from their countries of origin. LGBTQI plus people who are seeking asylum very often don't have that, or their networks are much smaller. They have high levels of isolation, and we see high levels of internalized homophobia, low self-esteem, and low confidence. So we provide psychosocial and emotional support services to help people out of this rut. So we help people to build their self-esteem, improve their confidence, be proud of who they are, and make friends and build social support networks. We also provide legal advice because it's really hard to present an asylum claim based on your sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics and be successful. And there's not many lawyers out there who know how to present these claims well. So a key part of our work is giving quality advice to people to help them succeed in the asylum system. And as I mentioned before, we do get involved in campaigning as well. And I'll talk a bit later about some of the issues that we work on. A lot of stories out there, and needless to say, it's a very, very challenging process. But to answer your first question about the title of this article about people being forgotten twice as LGBT refugees, I mean, I would almost say twice isn't enough. I think LGBT people seeking asylum, LGBT refugees get completely overlooked. They are very invisible, both within the LGBTQI plus community and within the refugee community, never mind the kind of wider population. And the problem is, if you don't see that they're there, then you don't recognize what their needs are. And then even if their needs are identified, they find it very hard for them to be met. Let me give you an example of that, what happens in this country, in the UK. In this country, if you're applying for asylum, the government will, you can apply to the government for support. So they can give you accommodation if you're eligible for it, and a very small amount of money. It's £39 a week. But I mean, that amount of money is really not enough to live off. It's certainly not enough now during a pandemic, but you're meant to use that money to pay for your food, to pay for your clothing, to buy your toiletries, to pay for your transport. You know, that amount of money is quite traumatic for some people trying to survive off that. But I was going back to within the needs of LGBTQI plus people specifically. The accommodation that the government gives you is normally shared with other people. So you can end up sharing not just a house or an apartment, but even your room with somebody else that you've never met before. You have no choice about where this flat or apartment or house is. You have no choice about who you share with either. And what happens when you don't recognize, if you don't recognize that LGBTQI plus people have particular needs, you can put people in quite a dangerous situation, because people end up being exposed to all kinds of homophobic, biphobic, transphobic abuse and harassment in this accommodation. And, you know, sometimes if the government or the Home Office thinks it's doing the right thing by putting people at least with others from the same country. So at least if, they can speak their native language and understand one another. But for an LGBTQI plus person, that might be the last thing that they want, because, they've fled their country of origin, often to flee persecution from society or members of their very own family. And then you've just put them back into accommodation where that risk is right there in the place where they're meant to feel safe. So that's just about them being invisible or being overlooked. And then you asked me to talk a little bit about the process that people go through. So asylum basically means getting protection in a country outside your country of origin. And that protection is from persecution. And that persecution can be from the government. There are 69 countries around the world that criminalize same-sex relations, for example. And very often that is, it is a persecutory environment. It can also be persecution from wider society as well. So even if there is no criminalizing law, you can still be persecuted. Stigmatized as well, yeah. And that stigma can have a really profound effect at both an individual level and in terms of their opportunities in life. So to get that protection, you have to apply for asylum. And while you're in the process of that, in that application process, either applying to the Home Office or possibly appealing a Home Office decision to the tribunal, the legal term is an asylum seeker. So you have a legal status, you're an asylum seeker. And if you are successful and you are granted asylum, that's when you become a refugee. Now, for somebody to be recognized as an LGBTQI plus refugee, they have to prove to the Home Office or the tribunal that they are the person they say they are. They have to prove their sexual orientation or their gender identity, for example. And, most of the time, you just tell somebody, for example, I'm a bisexual woman or I'm a trans man, and they will believe you. So it's really, really hard to then have to prove this to the Home Office. And, there's no one way to do that. There's no test, for example. There's no one way that somebody can tell if you're telling the truth or not about this. Policy terms, in theory, all LGBTQI plus people should be treated the same. And, the government guidance is actually quite good in this sense. Like, it shouldn't be harder if you're a lesbian woman or a bisexual man, or if you've got children. That there's nothing in law on paper that says, that there's additional questions to be asked, for example. In practice, it's quite different, as you say. We have seen people refuse asylum because if they were bisexual, the Home Office has told them that they can go back to their country of origin and just be with somebody of the opposite sex. Or they have disbelieved people saying, I can't believe you're a lesbian because you have children. So there's a lot of intersections at play here. It's also related to gender. It's also, it's related to your sexual orientation. It's quite often related to your level of education as well. Because, if you've been ashamed of who you are your whole life, or you've come from a society where it is taboo to speak about sex, sexuality, relationships, emotions, and let alone for people who are LGBTQI plus, like, it's incredibly hard to suddenly talk about this in front of a decision maker. And if your level of education can make a difference in that situation in terms of being able to articulate your case. So there are a lot of intersections at play. And there are also, unfortunately, a lot of stereotypes which are based quite often on a kind of a Western assumption about what it means to be LGBTQI plus. And I say it's a stereotype because this doesn't even apply to everybody here in Britain or everybody in Europe or everybody in the global north. But for example, one stereotype that is employed, and we've seen this both in the Home Office and sadly sometimes in the tribunal as well, but there's an assumption that if you are LGBTQI plus, then you cannot be religious or you cannot follow a particular faith. I've got a couple of quotes here I can read from my screen that have been in the refusal letters from the Home Office, saying that it literally, in one word for word, this letter said, you claim not to have thought about the conflict between your religion and your sexuality. So they've assumed there's a conflict. And there's also a related assumption or stereotype that you must have gone through a process of self-reflection and introspection and resolved this conflict. So I can read you a quote from another letter, which said, you have failed to demonstrate how you would have reconciled your sexuality with your religion. And I think, this makes it, really problematic for people, bearing in mind those cultural differences as well. Not everybody has that kind of, your religion can be part of your kind of national identity, for example, and to expect people to have gone through a process of self-reflection and introspection is just not fair, given the variety of the billions of people in this world. As an organisation, we do provide training, and we are available to provide it for other NGOs, for lawyers, for the Home Office. The training is available. But when it comes to the Home Office, the issue seems to be what's called the standard of proof. And I don't believe that more and more training is going to solve this problem. What the standard of proof refers to is the fact that to be accepted or recognized as a refugee, you don't need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that you need protection. That's the level or the threshold in criminal law. It's much lower. You have to prove that it's reasonably likely that you'd be at risk of harm if you're sent back to your country of origin. But the examples I've given you show that the Home Office is sometimes setting that bar too high. There was, in terms of the evidence that people can sometimes provide for their claims, it's partly about what you say yourself, and that's the most important evidence you can give. But people can often have evidence from other sources. For example, if they've got a membership of a gay nightclub, or I know of one person who had borrowed a lot of lesbian literature from the library, so she was able to provide her library records. So, there's different types of kind of evidence that you can provide, but even that isn't always enough for the Home Office. So there was one case where somebody provided 90 photos of themselves with their partner, but then the Home Office didn't accept those photographs, and so also saying that these photographs were self-serving. But at the same time, they also noted that the two of them didn't have any joint utility bills. So the evidence they did provide wasn't good enough, but yet at the same time, the Home Office was expecting evidence they didn't have. There's a difference in the rights that people have. So, in both cases, you've got, you're legally allowed to be here. But if you're still in the asylum system, so you're an asylum seeker, you're not allowed to work. And you don't have access to the mainstream benefit system. There's a separate support system, which is the one where I said under £40 a week to live off. And accommodation as well, but you have no choice, like I said before, about where it is or who you live with as well if you're a single adult. Whereas if you've got refugee status, you are allowed to work and you do have access to the mainstream benefits system, and you do have access to almost everything that people who've got long-term residency here or British citizenship have access to. We found that people have got heightened levels of anxiety and depression at this time. It's come about, partly because of lockdown in itself. I think, a lot of people in this country are experiencing both of those to a greater level. But for our client group, at home or the places they live, they often don't have somebody they can trust or they can talk to, and coming into our office and attending one of our social events or one of our support group meetings meant that they could meet with other people in a situation like themselves, in a situation similar to the ones that they're in. not having access to that, and at the same time not having internet where they live, has been really, really hard. I mean, you and I are talking on Zoom now, but for somebody seeking asylum, that 30, like I've said before, that £39 a week has to cover everything, and it doesn't necessarily extend to having internet access. They can't go out to the Wi-Fi hotspots like they used to. A lot of them are closed. So even as lockdown has been lifted, it hasn't necessarily solved that problem. There's also reason to be concerned about our client group being more at risk of acquiring COVID-19. Being in a shared room with someone else normally doesn't allow for you to self-isolate. And a lot of asylum accommodation is overcrowded, and people are sharing bathroom facilities, for example, with a lot of other people. And, at the same time, people can't afford to buy the extra soap or the hand sanitizer, for example, that's advised. And at UKLGAG, what we're aware of now, and I think one of my colleagues is doing it today, is trying to buy people face masks, because if you go on public transport, you have to use a face mask from Monday. Where's the money for that? How are people meant to afford this? UKLGAG with other NGOs has been campaigning for the government to increase asylum support rates during this period by £20 a week. And it took weeks for the ministers to make a decision on this. And when they finally announced it, the increase was £1.85 a week. That's 26 pence per day. So we haven't given up. We're still fighting for that extra £20 a week. That's how much universal credit was increased by. And we're campaigning longer term as well, because even when the lockdown is lifted, even if the pandemic goes away, people cannot live on the amount of money that the government provides for them. We can, yes. I think firstly, well, you've made a really good point. I think it's really important to understand people's rights and entitlements, because I think a lot of people don't realize that refugees, or if they have a document that, a biometric card that says refugee on it, that does give them permission to work. So that's the first thing. And also, don't be put off by the fact that refugees normally have 5 years leave to remain, because very often that is extended to become permanent leave to remain. And I think within the recruitment process, there are some changes that can be made. Refugees, like all kinds of people, have a variety of skills and experience and knowledge they can bring, but often not being familiar with how recruitment works in the UK can be a barrier. So, making sure your application form is really simple and really clear. And even better, if you can offer assistance, or, whether it's in person or just guidance on the form itself as an accompanying document to help people understand what you're looking for in the answers, so they can fill it out. On those application forms as well. I mean, I think language barriers are an issue. But I think it is also about recruitment processes being different, because I have seen it among people I know who, can do the job, but they're just not familiar with what the recruitment process is. And that's the stumbling block. And you kind of know, like, if you got the job, you do great, but this process is in the way. And yeah, I was just going to say one other thing, but on the application form, a lot of employers ask for explanations of any gaps in employment history. And I would ask if you really need to know that at the application stage, because people won't necessarily want to tell you, I was an asylum seeker, for example, it can take so long for the Home Office to make a decision on your claim. It can take years. And, not forcing somebody to disclose that to you just means you might be able to get more applications in through the door. And I would just add that, if you have within the workplace as well, for staff that you are employing, do offer English classes and do ensure there's kind of career progression schemes or leadership schemes, because what happens with a lot of refugees is they're also working at a level beneath what they're capable of. And there's some structural issues there. And I think a lot of employers, including the charity sector, need to proactively address that. Yeah, yes, exactly. We've got the Contact Us page. You can also find us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and on Facebook as well. Yeah, we give one-off legal advice pro bono. We also refer people to good quality legal representation. And actually, we're about to launch a new program for lawyers. So, yeah, if somebody's working for a law firm and they're interested, then please do get in touch.